Okay, so today I'm going to do something a little different. I made a Twitter account for the Court of Reason, and basically I'm just going through a lot of my older quotes and sayings from my old debate format. It was in 2013 that I hosted it, so most of them, I'm even putting the year that it's from. Generally, they're going to be from 2013, but if I remember it coming later on, I'll try to reference that. But yeah, just to kind of put a framing on this, I will go through and just read each one that I posted so far, just whatever comes to mind, whatever I remember, or some of the core ones that I know very well. All different expressions and logical razors and stuff like that that I would use in there, many of which are my terms. Like I coined the phrases or I coined the exact logical razor, even if, again, I'm not saying similar ideas haven't ever been said by anybody, but just it's either an extension of it or it's just the phrasing that I take pride in, like, you know, the way it's said in like a short form, just to get something across very clear and concise in a very short amount of words. That's very valuable because people are sometimes very fickle for stuff like that. Like if it's too long form, even though the long form postulate is one of my core tenets, that anything worth discussing is worth discussing in long form, otherwise it's not worth doing at all. But generally it goes over better if you reduce it to a very short form. It's easier for people to get grasp on, and you know, with their short attention spans or whatever. So you cannot you cannot dissuade with reason what came about by desire. So that has to do with the religion, as far as like if you were trying to convince somebody not to be religious or even just criticize it or attack it in some way, right? The fact that they believe in religion doesn't have to do with logic and reason and facts. You can't use logic and reason and facts to dissuade them from believing it, because that's not why they believe it in the first place, right? It comes from some sort of psychological need or desire or some other basis, right? That's the problem. So it's two different reasons. The way you could really convince them not to believe it is by appealing to that desire in some other way, then give them some peace of mind or some other structure, right, that gives them the same satisfaction, and then they'll no longer desire it. Your experience is why we give you the microphone, but does not obligate us to listen or agree. So this is the fallacy of obviously using your stature and experience as an argument. Like, pretend like some big famous celebrities up on stage, right? Whoever it might be, Ben Shapiro, or you know, just anybody, right? They have experience in a certain field. Some ex-politician, some Elon Musk is up on stage, right? And I get called up, or you, just some random person gets called up, and we're having a debate and discussion about something. But then they could fall back and say, well, but you haven't accomplished what they've accomplished, or you know, oh, it's Elon Musk, so how could they be wrong, or how could you question them? But no, that's the reason why they get the microphone, why they get the attention, why we're all there to listen to them, right? All of that stuff, we give them the benefit of the doubt and the spotlight. But now once they have it, they're still obligated to make a good case with it, right? They have to make a good argument. They have to make sense. So on one topic or another, you might make a better argument than them. So the fallback position shouldn't be that, oh, well, even though I'm wrong on this topic, or you make a better case, somehow, you know, oh, because you're Elon Musk, now you're just automatically right on everything. No, you would assume they'd have a better, you know, breadth of experience to draw from to make a good argument. But if they don't do it, then, you know, all these appeal to egos are used in arguments too much, and it's a fallacy. Like, oh, but my experience as a woman gives me this credibility, or my experience as a black person, or whatever. Like those things shouldn't be the criteria. They can be a backbone of what you're saying, but then what you're saying should inherently have value to it, and to the point where it doesn't matter really who's saying it, right? So your experience will give us the reason to listen to you, to read your book, to watch your speech, to come to your seminar. But then once you're there, you have to actually make coherent arguments, rather than just, well, you can't question me because of my stature, or everything I say is valuable just because of my stature. And it's also like a cult of personality argument when it comes to, you know, everything somebody says. You know, they could be saying the most mundane thing, but oh, you care about that. They're just telling some random story on a late night talk show. If some random person said the same exact thing, you wouldn't care. But oh, because of the person saying it, now you're placing special value on it rather than what they're actually saying. And there was one other point with that I was going to say, like your experience as far as like using it almost as an excuse for something too, like to shut down even discourse, to say, oh, who are you to question me because of my experience, you know, that kind of thing. This is a sort of a takedown of astrology, right, and horoscopes and stuff. Imagine blaming celestial objects for personal problems. That's one that I've seen quoted even on YouTube by somebody who was a part of that and everything. But yeah, this is more like a funny one, but it's sort of a satirical way to look at it. Like, and you might say, oh, that's not what astrology is about, but in a literal sense, at least with horoscopes and stuff, they are telling you like these very oddly specific things, like you should do this today or don't do this today. Buy something today and it'll go well, or you're gonna have bad luck, or it gives you like very specific directions that have nothing to do with the celestial objects that you're basing this on. Like it's like fortune cookie type stuff that doesn't have anything to do with it. So the difference between a human function and a human being, now that's a term that I almost deserves to be defined on its own, but I won't even bother. But that's just a term I would use to show somebody who you're like reduced to your function in life and society, like your job, or you're defined by what you do more so than what you think, or you're defined more by the role that society gives you than in spite of it, right? You can still serve that role, but you're defined too heavily by it, and you kind of just go along. So you choose between what's chosen for you, like, oh, you'll choose what to wear on the way to doing something that's already predetermined for you, right? Rather than self-actualizing more. And a human being is that one treats contrivance response as absolute and proceeds to struggle with that fact that it isn't, whereas the other is simply aware of that fact. So, like the inherent conflict of just trying to survive, right, in nature, in the wild, versus the conflict of, you're struggling with the fact that, oh, you're pretending like certain things are so to exist in an overextended contrivance state like society, but then you're struggling with something else, right? That's sort of, you're misforming what the real conflict actually is. So you pretend like, oh yeah, society is a real absolute thing instead of a construct, but then you see all these inconsistencies and have all this cognitive dissonance with it, right, that you struggle from. Like, you value appearances, but then appearances don't actually matter or have any impact. You have to kind of have dual interpretations, or like you are meant to value people on a social level, but then you can't value them too much, or that's obsessive, or you can't value them too little, or that's somehow a bad thing too. And then like it's just all these inconsistencies that it creates, right? So the real objective way to look at it is, you're not saying what somebody should value or whether somebody should value something or not, but you're just holding it accountable to be consistent. Like, if it's worth doing, then it's worth doing fully, right? Absolutely, all the time. Or if it's not worth doing, then don't do it at all, instead of this half-mass state that you get reduced to, where you're kind of just doing it you're just doing it in pretense. Rule by omission can be described as follows. If a store owner is in front of you doing all the work themselves, they open themselves up to judgment and scrutiny. However, if a CEO is continents away, they're out of sight and out of mind and immune from this initial basis. So think of that like as going to Walmart. At Walmart, you might give the cashier a hard time, but the owner is nowhere to be found, but you'll still keep going there, right? And you won't judge the owner or somebody else because they're not there. So people only think of this initial way. So the best way to control people is exactly that. Like, if you're there doing the work yourself, rather than being grateful or respecting that, although to some extent people might do that, they will actually give you a hard time or pick on every little thing or judge everything because it's in front of them in their, senses. So now they'll, even if they're generally might have a positive thing, you're opening yourself up to judgment and criticism in a way that you wouldn't. Oh, I'm in Hawaii somewhere, I'm a millionaire CEO of a big company, so now I'm immune from criticism because nobody's even aware of me and nobody's thinking about me. But they'll give the cashier a hard time, or again, they would give the owner a hard time if they were there. So it just shows you that people reward the wrong thing, right? By being there yourself, you open yourself up to criticism. But by not being there, you are somehow immune from it. Because again, people don't think that deeply about it. So there's kind of a deeper way to analyze that too, but I can't exactly come up with it. Like, just something that's in front of you is going to be judged, even if it's not important, right, or relevant, whereas something that is much more relevant is going to be ignored just because it's not right in front of you. So people are very reactionary. They'll only focus on what's directly in front of them. So you can control them just by that perception. Like, you can control like what's being focused on. So, oh, you're going to give the cashier a hard time, but you're still going to keep shopping there, right? Or something, because again, the owner is, you're not even thinking about them, you're just kind of doing your own thing. So you're punishing somebody for being there themselves, and you're rewarding somebody for ruling by omission is the concept. So it's similar to like what political leaders could do too. It's like, you don't even acknowledge the opposition exists, right? You pretend like you won't give a speech saying, oh, these dissenters are wrong and they're evil necessarily. You won't even acknowledge them, and you'll try to censor them. And so you'll say, everything's fine, everybody's happy, and you just won't even report on it, right? That's one way to deal with it. That's even better than, sometimes you can frame it as, oh, we need to have martial law to try to combat these dissidents. But instead of that, you could just disacknowledge it and say, if we don't talk about it and we don't report it and we cover it up, then it didn't happen, basically, because people are that initial minded and reactionary. Do not give any man a monopoly on sin. Obviously, negative cult of personality. You can give a modern example with this, like Trump or anybody really, but even if somebody is as bad as you supposedly say or think, right, realize that that's a variable factor. It's like the whole concept of, power corrupts. It's not so much the individual. Any individual could have the capacity for that, negative tendencies, etc. So the concept is, you shouldn't allow anybody to have too much power or absolute power, number one, where they could do such extreme things like, think about the H-man from the early 1900s. I'm not even going to say his name because whatever. It's just one of those dog whistle type things. But it's the individual. But when you make it about the individual, then you put yourself at the mercy. Like, so all it would take, if the reason why he did those things is because he's just such a bad guy, then you put yourself at the mercy of the next bad guy who comes along. Like, all it would take for that to happen again is for somebody to be equally bad or even worse, right? So what happens is, you should hold it accountable. This is what checks and balances is about, is the simple fact that you should never allow anybody to have too much power where they could do those things in the first place. So assume the worst of everybody. Even if it's the best person ever, you should only give them so much power to even do good, just in case. Or even if it's the worst person ever, you would only give them so much power to do bad, right? So you'd always have checks and balances and accountability. So you should always treat it the same way. So then the individual is less important, right? It could be the best person ever, the worst person ever, but you'd never give them too much power. And then the other thing is the fact that you could argue that, you shouldn't give that one particular person power at all because, they're just so bad, and society should be able to judge that. So you can look at all of, terrible events in history as a failure of society. Like, how could they allow that person to come to power in the first place? And even if you say, it's through fear and coercion and stuff, it's still the public's fault. Like, there's a certain responsibility to prevent that from happening and to detect it and have better judgment. But even if that fails, you should always have checks and balances and never get too comfortable or complacent or fall for little false flags and stuff. Don't specify the conflict. This one's very simple and short and to the point, but it's the principle of, again, a larger process, symptom versus disease, which basically just means the fact that, on any issue, you'd make it about something else. Like, the issue isn't human nature or something, broad like that. It's the fact that, it's this one group of people. Like, I'm going to stereotype and say, this group of people based on this identity is has such and such tendency, even though it's a fallacy on two levels. Not everybody who's part of that group is going to be that way, and not everybody who is that way is part of that group. So, you know what I mean? It could apply to everyone to some extent, that some, people broadly are going to be like that. So it's it's part of human nature, or something similar to that, where a process is going to exist where it applies to so many things that it's almost hard to come up with an example. But basically, don't specify the conflict. It's about something bigger, right? It's not about the individual. It's not about the specific party or group or identity. It's about just human nature. It's about a larger process that you can address, instead of trying to say, I don't know, the problem isn't them, right? It's some sort of other contrivance response that you can address, or it helps you explain it. Like, you can always try to overcompensate for the flawed process, but you should look at the flawed process itself and say, it's not your failure to overcompensate that's the issue. It's the need for that in the first place, the fact that you have to. Do not define a part by the whole or the whole by the part. Fallacy of the lowest common denominator, where that's kind of similar to what I just said too. Like, don't look at an individual in terms of, you belong to this group, so you must be a certain way, but there's still variables. Like, not everybody in the group is exactly the same. They might just have some general things they agree on, but they might differ in here and there in different topics, and vice versa. Like, just because you just because a group has like one bad member who does something bad out of a million people, right? That means that you're going to reduce everybody to the lowest common denominator to discredit them. Or even in a general sense, like you could say that about people's idiosyncrasies in general, like, you know, everybody has some sort of skeleton in their closet or some flaw or something. So if you want to use idiosyncrasy to discredit somebody, you can do that for everybody. It's just a question of whether you know it or not. Also, like the initial basis, like, oh, you hear something negative about somebody, so you believe that and discredit them, but you don't hear it about somebody else, even though if you dug deep enough, you would find something on them too if you really wanted to. So how many do we have left? We have 4 left. Yeah, this is just something I do here and there, so I guess I should just collectively do it like this so I don't have to post a video for every single one. Because otherwise I'll just never get around to it. This is one of my favorite ones, though, to do with religion. If your logic dictates that everything must be created, and your answer is that God created the universe, then what created God? If God can be exempt from the need to be created, then why not the universe? So basically just, it's human logic to say that everything must be created, right? Nobody says, you know, we don't know how the universe works to that extent to say that for sure. But if you assert as the claim maker, right, the burden is on the claim maker, you're saying that everything must be created. And your answer to that question or that need is that, okay, God must have created everything then. But then let's go one step further and say, okay, then what created God? And if your answer to that is, well, God's just above the need to be created and doesn't need to be, then couldn't you just come back and say, well, okay, I'm just going to say that about the universe then. You said that everything must be created, but then you immediately create an exception, right, to answer it. And so therefore, then I'll create an exception too and say, oh, well, the universe just came out of nowhere. It came out of thin air. It just materialized, right? But then you'd say, oh, that's ridiculous. Oh, so what's your answer? Oh, that God came out of nowhere and just materialized and then created the universe, right? Like, it's the same fallacy where you're saying an absolute that, oh, everything must be created, but then you make an exception. So you could make an exception in a different way by the same logic, right? We're holding it to the same accountability of your claim. Those who stand for nothing fall for anything or everything. I've kind of said that in both ways. The fallacy of fighting against rather than for something. This, once again, could be used with a modern example like Trump, with the whole platform being that, oh, he's so bad, he's so terrible. But you should, even once you decide that, right, if that's what you think, you should then try to say, let's try to find the best possible person instead of just insisting upon, oh, they're so bad, they're so bad. Like, we get that they're bad then, if that's your opinion, but you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't do any good for that. So there's some broader example to use, like, pretend you're like a bunch of rebels trying to attack and go against like an empire or something, right? Some corrupt establishment. You overthrow them, and your standard the whole time was they're so bad, they're so bad, they're so bad. But now once they're gone, now you don't know what you stand for, and so you can easily be manipulated by the next, you know, rogue leader or whatever, right? So you didn't stand for something, you stood against something. So now once you destroy that thing that you stand against, right, now you have nothing to stand for, so it'll be chaos or you'll fall for some other flawed process. Whereas if you stood for something, right, you might still topple them, but it would be like you're fighting for something, and so now you have more a sense of purpose instead of just, oh, it's easy just to say, oh, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, because you can always just have some idyllic perfect standard, like, well, everything is flawed in some way, so you'll, no matter what it is, you'll just always attack it and always criticize it. But there's no alternative that you're posing. You're just saying it's bad because it has a flaw, but then you're not providing a preferable alternative and based in reality. It's kind of what you hear like with socialism or something like that, where it's not a question whether that's practical, but it's like you'll use it to say, well, here are all the flaws of a free market, but then there are also flaws of socialism. There are also flaws of other systems. So, you know, it's not like you can't use one to justify the other when they both have flaws. So you have to make a more cohesive argument, or even just generally, again, it just makes more sense if you have an actual position that you stand for, which will lead to something better, right? Because the two lead to the same thing. Like if you say, let's just use the Trump example again, like, oh, he's so bad, he's so bad, he's so bad. But instead of focusing on that all the time, if you just said, let's try to find the best possible person, well, that would also apply that he's so bad, meaning that best person wouldn't be him by your criteria. So now find somebody else, find the best possible person instead of lowering your standards and saying, well, he's so bad, so let's just pick anybody because at least they're not him, right? That's lowering the standard. The problem with glorifying work is that it's a zero-sum process that serves self-interest. If one is not satisfied with the reward, then gratification should not be a placeholder for alternative labor. Like, this is a little bit hard to express in this character limit, but the idea is that you see this a lot with older people and antiquated results, like, well, back in my day I had to work like this and that, but now that you have the greater technology where you don't have to do that and remove the need, now glorifying that hard work is pointless, because it's like, it's just simply more efficient. So it was a zero-sum process then. So if you have better technology that makes it easier, then why wouldn't you use it? Or it sort of reveals that you were glorifying that just because it was necessary, not because it's inherently valuable. And so I always use this as an example too, like, pretend you're like a doctor and you make six figures and all this kind of stuff, but oh, you're so stressed, and you use that as an excuse for being a jerk or whatever, right? Or you're just so unhappy. Well, if you're not happy with it, then go quit your job and go work minimum wage, and now your workload is commensurate to the amount of money you make, so you might enjoy that more, right? Rather than acting like there's some inherent value in doing it. It's like, you know, if you're not happy with the amount of money you're making, or you're stressed out by your job relative to the amount that you're making, then you think it's not worth it. So then you can always go do something else. That's the point. Like, you know, it's your choice. You're doing it for yourself, right? So you act like, oh, I'm so stressed at my job. But if you're really so stressed, then don't do it. Then go do something similar that you're not stressed by. Even if you make less money, that's the compromise that you have to make. People sort of take for granted that, like, oh, they don't have a choice. And then closed structure contrivance is where a contrivance state is valued over anything else, allowing no external considerations, and it insists upon itself. All externality is viewed as a tool to reinforce the contrivance state unquestionably. It's kind of just any time where you're, you know, people do this on an individual level, like your worldview is going to be what you use as closed structure contrivance, that you don't look at something as a contrary way to sort of, you know, inform something different or be objective minded. You're going to instead just use it to reinforce and say, oh, that's ridiculous, because you're not familiar with it, or you'll ridicule something, you know, or you will use something to, I don't know, positively or negatively reinforce what you already think. It creates like the whole echo chamber vibe. It creates the idea that you're seeking confirmation bias. It creates the idea that you're able to consider the fact that this happens on a broad societal sense more so than anything, but you know, you're not allowed to consider, like for example, open relationships are a great example, right? People in open relationships could just be minding their own business, doing their own thing, but there's a great general stigma in society against it. Like, because society has to create this family system and has all these other incentives, they'll outwardly actively attack and condemn open relationships. Like when some big celebrity is in one and they break up, like Destiny that happened with, they'll make fun of it and ridicule and say, oh, the fact that Destiny broke up with Melina or whatever, right? It doesn't matter this specific example, but somebody conspicuous in the public eye, like a celebrity, breaks up and their open relationship doesn't work out. Now they'll use that to attack the open relationship and the very idea of having one. But by that same fallacy, you could say, well, anytime a celebrity, Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie break up or whoever, now you could say, well, that invalidates single partner relationships, right? Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, oh, look what it leads to. So that shows you those don't work either. So you can't use one to discredit all of them because it's just one conspicuous example. But there's a great insecurity that you have to, it's not enough for you to simply be at peace with what you're doing and practice that. You have to attack anything contrary. And so you'll say, oh, open relationships are bad. And the reason why they're bad is because you have to feel secure about your own sort of reduction to structure to say, well, society's not just tricking me into doing this because it's good for the family system or some other incentive, it's easier to control. It's actually that, oh no, it's the absolute thing, it's the right thing to do, let's moralize, etc., and let's condemn anything contrary. You're only doing that to try to convince yourself and bypass the cognitive dissonance associated with what you're doing. As if, you know, it goes against your inherent nature and tendency, inherent desired suggested tendencies. That's a term that I would use too, right? It goes against that. So you have to somehow justify it some other way by saying, well, you're able to, you're able to pretend like you actually desire it, even if you're only doing it for strictly functional and contrived reasons.